June 1943. A troop train rattled through the American countryside, its windows crowded with tired faces in gray field uniforms. These were not victorious soldiers on leave, but captured men of the Wehrmacht, prisoners of war taken in North Africa. They had survived Rommel's desert campaigns only to be sent halfway across the world, uncertain of their fate. Whispers traveled along the train cars. What would the Americans do with them? The train halted at a siding near a sprawling military hospital, and a hush fell over the prisoners. Some men were carried on stretchers, gaunt and feverish, wounds still festering from the desert fighting. Others hobbled on makeshift crutches, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. In German military culture, prisoners wounded in action were considered liabilities, to be hidden away, patched up only if resources allowed. Here, however, the Americans did something entirely different. Medical corpsmen rushed forward, not with contempt, but with urgency, lifting stretchers, checking pulses, speaking in calm, practiced tones. To the bewildered Germans, it was the first impossible sight. Inside the hospital, the contradictions grew sharper. White-coat nurses, some barely older than the prisoners themselves, recorded names, injuries, and dietary needs. Surgeons prepared operating theaters as though their patients were not enemies, but comrades. One soldier, a 19-year-old private with shrapnel lodged deep in his abdomen, was wheeled past his stunned companions. "Will they let him die?" one prisoner whispered. Minutes later, the doors swung open again, and the same young man was under anesthesia, attended by American doctors who handled him with the same care they gave their own. For German eyes conditioned by years of propaganda, it was a scene that defied logic. Equally astonishing was who performed the work. Among the medics were men of different races, white and black soldiers in the same uniforms, moving side by side. In Nazi ideology, this was unthinkable. Yet here, an African-American medic calmly drew blood from a captured German officer, his hand steady, his voice reassuring. The officer stiffened, expecting mockery or rough treatment. Instead, the medic asked if he was in pain and adjusted the needle so it would not hurt. It was a small gesture, but it shook assumptions as deeply as any battlefield defeat. That evening, the prisoners were led into a ward where American GIs occupied the opposite beds. The same nurses checked both groups, charting fevers, delivering penicillin, and changing bandages. Radios played swing music softly in the background. Across the room, an American soldier propped up on pillows grinned at a German who could barely lift his head. "Not so tough now," the GI teased, though without cruelty. The German stared back in disbelief, realizing he had been placed in the same room with the same food and medicine as the very men who had been trying to kill him weeks earlier. The shock was only beginning for the captured Germans. The first days in American care blurred into a series of bewildering contradictions. At dawn, medics checked temperatures not with rough hands or indifference, but with quiet efficiency. Trays arrived bearing meals that exceeded the rations of many German civilians. Scrambled eggs, bacon, bread thickly spread with butter, and steaming coffee. The prisoners ate in silence, some too suspicious to finish their plates, others marveling at the sheer abundance. They expected watery soup and crusts of bread. Instead, they received portions that seemed meant to restore them, not punish them. One incident circulated among the wards and quickly became legend. A sergeant from the Afrika Korps, wounded in both legs, required surgery that only the newly discovered miracle drug could make survivable: penicillin. In Germany, this medicine was almost mythical, reserved for the highest-ranking officers, and even then supplied in tiny amounts. Yet here, in a hospital thousands of miles from the front, the sergeant received full treatment. American doctors injected the precious antibiotic without hesitation, as though his life mattered as much as any of their own men. For the Germans who witnessed it, disbelief mingled with reluctant admiration. How could an enemy be so generous? Even more unsettling was the atmosphere of openness. Guards were present, but they did not bark orders or threaten with rifles. Instead, they seemed relaxed, chatting with nurses or listening to the radio while keeping watch. The prisoners soon realized they were not treated as dangerous criminals, but as patients. They were permitted to write letters, handed Red Cross parcels, and even asked about their religious needs. 4 Jewish prisoners, a category many feared to acknowledge. Kosher meals were provided without ridicule. To those indoctrinated by years of anti-Semitic propaganda, the sight of Jewish American soldiers distributing food with calm professionalism was almost incomprehensible. Outside the hospital, the impressions deepened. When groups of recovering prisoners were escorted across the grounds, they saw civilians moving freely within sight of military installations. Vendors sold coffee near the gates. Families strolled past without fear, and children waved at soldiers boarding buses. In Germany, secrecy shrouded every military facility, and fear surrounded every encounter with the state. Here, life went on casually, as though the war was a distant inconvenience rather than an existential struggle. To men raised in a culture of paranoia and scarcity, America seemed less like an enemy and more like a different world entirely. One POW later recalled in his memoir that the most disturbing thing was not the weapons or the industrial might he glimpsed. It was the calmness. They acted, he wrote, as if victory was already certain, and we were no more than guests who had overstayed our welcome. The phrase captured the growing realization among his comrades. This society was so secure in its strength that it extended mercy not from weakness, but from confidence. The journey inland revealed yet another layer of strangeness. After their stay in military hospitals, many prisoners were transported by train to holding camps across America. They expected locked cattle cars and secrecy, the kind of treatment they themselves had imposed on captives. Instead, they were placed in passenger coaches with cushioned seats, windows wide open to the passing scenery. At each station, civilians could see them clearly, and yet there was no attempt to hide this movement of enemies. Families waved to their sons in uniform. Teenagers lounged near soda counters, and newspapers were sold openly on the platforms. On the very same platforms, German prisoners in full view stood guarded yet unharmed. The openness of it all was almost more frightening than barbed wire. The trains passed steel mills and aircraft factories, their names painted boldly on rooftops in letters large enough to be read from the ground. To German military eyes, this was reckless exposure. Why allow enemy soldiers to witness production sites? Why show them the scale of industry in motion? Yet that was precisely the point. The sheer confidence of a nation that displayed its might instead of concealing it told a story louder than propaganda. Blast furnaces glowed in the night, spewing orange light into the sky, as though daring anyone to challenge their power. For the prisoners watching through glass, it was like glimpsing a civilization so vast it could not be threatened. Arriving at camps deep in the American interior, the surprises continued. Wooden barracks awaited them, not mud huts or filthy cells. Each man found a bed with sheets and blankets, electric light above, and hot water in communal showers. Medical inspections were routine, and wounds were treated without hesitation. When one officer suffering from appendicitis collapsed on the parade ground, he was rushed to surgery immediately. The operation was successful, and within weeks he returned to his barracks, astonished that his enemy had saved his life with resources Germany barely possessed for its own. The structure of the camps unsettled them as much as the comforts. Instead of rigid orders from above, the prisoners were told they would elect spokesmen to represent them. They could organize activities, manage schedules, and even publish newspapers. To men drilled in authoritarian obedience, such liberties seemed either a trick or a sign of madness. Yet day by day, they realized it was genuine. They were being trusted to govern themselves within boundaries, as though America sought not only to hold them, but to teach them. At night, the camp canteens buzzed with quiet astonishment. Cigarettes, chocolate, even art supplies were available for purchase with scrip earned from labor. Many prisoners sat stunned at tables, sketching or writing letters, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. An America of cruelty and chaos had been promised. What they found was something far more dangerous to their worldview. An enemy who fought fiercely in battle, yet extended unexpected dignity in captivity. By late summer of 1943, many of the German prisoners had been assigned to labor programs across the American South and Midwest. The War Manpower Commission authorized their work in agriculture and industry, a necessity during wartime shortages. To their astonishment, these assignments were not backbreaking punishments, but practical partnerships. On Texas ranches, they worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black farmhands, herding cattle across lands so vast they dwarfed entire German provinces. The scale of American agriculture left them speechless. Where they had once relied on horses and hand tools, here they watched as machines devoured fields and small airplanes circled overhead to scout herds. The rhythm of work shocked them further. Breaks were frequent, meals plentiful, and supervisors treated them less like enemies than temporary employees. One POW recalled how a foreman offered him a cigarette after a long morning in the cotton fields, joking in broken German, "Even the enemy needs a smoke." Laughter spread among the workers, and for a moment the barriers of nationality seemed to dissolve. To men steeped in rigid hierarchy, the casual camaraderie of Americans was unnerving. It revealed a different kind of power, one rooted not in fear, but in confidence. Perhaps the greatest shock came when prisoners encountered open criticism of authority. Farmers grumbled loudly about government quotas, workers joked about Roosevelt, and newspapers published cartoons lampooning politicians. In Germany, such defiance would have been unthinkable, punishable by imprisonment or death. Here it was part of everyday life. One prisoner, stunned after overhearing a farmer curse at a Department of Agriculture inspector, wrote in his diary, "They insult their leaders, and yet nothing happens. This is madness, and yet perhaps strength." Religion, too, played a disorienting role. Local churches invited prisoners to attend Sunday services, seating them among congregations whose sons were fighting overseas. In one small Texas town, a choir learned German carols to perform on Christmas Eve, their voices carrying across a camp lit by a towering tree strung with electric lights. Guards recorded that some hardened officers wept openly, unable to comprehend why their enemies' mothers would sing to them in their own tongue. For those prisoners, the holiday celebration struck deeper than any lecture on democracy could. Meanwhile, the presence of women in roles of authority unsettled them profoundly. Female nurses ran hospital wards, women managed factories, and even flew training aircraft at nearby airfields. In Nazi Germany, such images were denounced as degeneracy. In America, they were simply reality. One group of POWs returning from work at a cotton gin watched in disbelief as a young woman parked a truck loaded with supplies and strode confidently past them. "If our commanders saw this," a soldier muttered, "they would call it weakness, but she looked stronger than most men I know." Each day chipped away at their certainties. The brutality they expected never arrived. Instead, the enemy's compassion and casual freedom left them struggling with questions they had never dared to ask. In the quiet of the barracks, some admitted the most dangerous truth of all, that the Americans were not only winning the war, they were winning their minds. By 1944, the American program of prisoner labor and re-education had become more organized, and its effects rippled through every camp. Libraries were stocked with thousands of books, including works banned in Germany. Prisoners who once sneered at decadent literature now pored over novels by Thomas Mann or Erich Maria Remarque, discovering voices their homeland had silenced. University professors traveled to the camps, giving lectures in history, mathematics, and agriculture. What began as voluntary courses soon attracted hundreds, then thousands. For many of these men, it was the first time they encountered ideas without censorship. Even the camp newspapers mirrored this transformation. Early editions brimmed with defiant slogans and veiled Nazi rhetoric. But as months passed, their tone shifted. Articles began to discuss democratic principles, labor rights, even the value of free press. American officers allowed these publications to evolve organically, confident that exposure to open dialogue would do more than lectures ever could. For the prisoners who edited and read them, the change was subtle but unmistakable. They were learning to question, to debate, to consider perspectives outside rigid ideology. Yet the most powerful lessons did not come from books or classrooms, but from the mundane. At food canneries in Texas, prisoners watched as perfectly edible vegetables were discarded because of minor blemishes. They stood stunned as workers apologized for the waste, not realizing that for men raised in scarcity, such abundance felt almost cruel. At aluminum plants, they shoveled scrap metal into bins larger than what German factories could acquire in months. At first they assumed it was arrogance, but slowly they grasped the deeper truth. This was not wastefulness, but confidence in a system that could produce endlessly. Racial dynamics added another layer of disorientation. German officers who bristled at taking orders from Black American guards discovered their protests were ignored. To them, being commanded by a man whom their ideology deemed inferior was unbearable. But the guards enforced discipline with calm authority, and the Germans quickly learned compliance was expected, regardless of their prejudices. The contradictions deepened when they were permitted to eat in restaurants or attend churches where those same black soldiers were denied entry. In those moments, the prisoners glimpsed both America's progress and its flaws, contradictions that gnawed at their rigid notions of superiority. Personal stories captured this transformation vividly. One officer, a committed believer in Nazi doctrine, later admitted that his convictions began to falter not in a classroom, but at Christmas when townspeople brought gifts to the camp. The generosity of families who had lost sons in battle overwhelmed him. "These people owed us nothing," he wrote years later, "yet they gave as though we were their own. That night, I understood that victory was not only in weapons, but in spirit." By the end of 1944, surveys conducted quietly within the camps showed that the majority of prisoners had begun to admire, even envy, the society that had captured them. They entered the camps as enemies. Many would leave with a conviction that the future of Germany could not be rebuilt on old foundations. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the transformation of Germany's captured soldiers had become undeniable. What began with astonishment in hospital wards ended in a profound rethinking of their world. For men who had marched under banners of superiority, the greatest shock was not military defeat, but the realization that an open society had disarmed them without firing a shot. America had exposed them to freedoms they had been told were weaknesses. Yet those very freedoms proved unshakable. In the camps, the final months were marked by preparation for return. Vocational programs taught trades desperately needed in a shattered Europe. Mechanics learned to repair engines. Farmers studied crop rotation and soil management. Future teachers were trained in democratic principles. At lecture halls inside barbed wire, prisoners listened to visiting officials explain reconstruction plans already underway. The message was simple yet stunning. America would help rebuild, not destroy, their homeland. To men conditioned to expect vengeance, this generosity was incomprehensible. The effect lingered long after the gates opened. Of the hundreds of thousands who returned to Germany, many carried more than memories of captivity. They brought with them habits formed in barracks libraries, lessons learned in classrooms, and the unsettling memory of being treated with dignity by those they had sworn to kill. When they spoke of America to their families, it was not of brutality, but of abundance, not of humiliation, but of fairness. Letters from that period, preserved in archives, reveal a theme repeated again and again. We saw another way to live. For some, the pull of that discovery was too strong to resist. A few escaped and built secret lives within the United States, marrying, working, and raising families until decades later when they surrendered voluntarily. Others, once repatriated, applied to return legally, becoming citizens who contributed to industries and communities across the country. In interviews years later, they admitted that the moment their ideology cracked was not in battle, but in the presence of an American medic who bandaged a wound, or a nurse who spoke kindly in halting German, or a guard who treated them as men rather than monsters. Historians have often described these encounters as the quiet victory of the war, a triumph not measured in territory or tonnage, but in ideas. By demonstrating democracy through daily life, America achieved what propaganda alone could never secure. The POWs had expected cruelty. They found compassion. They anticipated scorn. They witnessed fairness. In those contradictions lay the seeds of change, seeds that would later sprout in the democratic soil of post-war Germany. Looking back decades later, one former prisoner put it plainly: they won us without chains. They won us by showing us a freedom so ordinary to them, but so extraordinary to us that we could not resist it. His words captured the essence of a transformation that began with disbelief in hospital wards, when enemy medics saved lives that could have been left to fade. It ended with a recognition that the true strength of a nation is not only in the power of its armies, but in the humanity it extends, even to those who once swore to destroy it. The story of the German POWs in America is not just a footnote to World War II. It is a testament to the revolutionary idea that victory in war must be followed by victory in peace, and that the latter requires not vengeance, but understanding, not punishment, but transformation. The program that brought these men from battlefield to barracks, from ideology to enlightenment, was not without its critics. Some argued it was too lenient, that resources spent on enemy comfort could have been better used elsewhere. Others questioned whether the transformation was genuine or merely performative, a survival strategy adopted by pragmatic men. These criticisms had merit. Not every prisoner experienced a genuine change of heart. Some remained committed Nazis. Others simply learned to mouth democratic platitudes while harboring unchanged beliefs. But the overwhelming evidence suggests that for the majority, something profound had shifted. Post-war studies tracking these former prisoners found remarkable patterns. Those who had been held in American camps showed significantly higher rates of participation in democratic institutions upon return to Germany. They were more likely to join civic organizations, less likely to support extremist political movements, and more likely to advocate for reconciliation with former enemies. Their children received better educations, their communities recovered more quickly from the war's devastation, and their businesses adopted more modern, egalitarian practices. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual lives. In the crucial years of German Reconstruction, these men became bridges between the old Germany and the new. They could speak credibly to their countrymen about democracy because they had lived it, not as an abstract concept in a textbook, but as a daily reality in prisoner of war camps across America. When Marshall Plan aid began flowing into Germany, it was often these former prisoners who could explain to skeptical Germans why accepting American help was not surrender, but wisdom. They had seen American generosity firsthand and knew it was genuine. The program also had unintended diplomatic consequences. As Cold War tensions escalated, the fair treatment of German POWs became a powerful propaganda tool, contrasting sharply with Soviet treatment of prisoners. Germans who might have been sympathetic to Soviet promises saw the stark difference between American and Soviet captivity. The choice between West and East Germany was made easier for many by memories of American prisoner camps, where dignity was preserved even in defeat. Perhaps most importantly, the POW experience challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and conflict. The prevailing wisdom of the time held that ideological enemies, especially those as deeply indoctrinated as Nazi soldiers, could not be changed. They could only be defeated, contained, or eliminated. The American POW program proved otherwise. It demonstrated that even men who had committed themselves to the most evil ideology of the 20th century could, when exposed to different ideas and treated with basic human dignity, undergo genuine transformation. This lesson would influence American policy for decades. During the Cold War, it informed strategies for dealing with communist bloc prisoners. In later conflicts, from Vietnam to Iraq, the principle that hearts and minds matter as much as military victories could be traced back to lessons learned from German POWs in World War II. The program was not perfect. Mistakes were made, opportunities missed, and some prisoners fell through the cracks. But its overall success was undeniable. It showed that the true measure of a civilization is not just how it treats its own citizens, but how it treats its defeated enemies. The German prisoners came to America expecting the barbarism their propaganda had promised. Instead, they found a nation so confident in its values that it could afford to be generous even to those who had sought its destruction. They expected to be broken by captivity. Instead, they were rebuilt, not through coercion, but through exposure to a different way of life. They came as enemies convinced of their own superiority. They left as men who had glimpsed a society that was, in crucial ways, superior to their own, not because of racial theories or military might, but because of its fundamental commitment to human dignity and freedom. The transformation of German POWs in America stands as one of the most successful re-education programs in history. It achieved its goals not through indoctrination, but through demonstration, not through punishment, but through example. It proved that the weapons of war are not only bombs and bullets, but also ideas, principles, and the simple act of treating others with the respect every human being deserves. When the last German POW left American soil in 1946, he carried with him more than just his belongings. He carried memories of a nation that had defeated him in battle but had not destroyed him in captivity. He carried lessons about democracy that no classroom could have taught. And he carried hope that the future could be different from the past. That hope, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of former prisoners, helped build the foundation for modern Germany. It contributed to the economic miracle of the 1950s, the stability of German democracy, and the reconciliation between former enemies that seemed impossible in 1945. The guards who watched over these prisoners, the doctors who treated them, the farmers who work alongside them, and the families who welcomed them into their churches probably did not realize they were participating in one of history's great experiments in transformation. They were simply doing what they believed was right, treating prisoners as the Geneva Conventions required and as American values demanded. But their everyday actions, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of camps, accomplished something extraordinary. They turned enemies into witnesses, witnesses into students, and students into ambassadors for a different future. The German POWs who returned home with changed minds became living proof that people can change, that ideology can be challenged, and that the cycle of hatred can be broken. Their story reminds us that in the aftermath of even the most brutal conflicts, there is a choice. Victors can choose vengeance, or they can choose transformation. They can choose to perpetuate hatred, or they can choose to plant seeds of reconciliation. America, in its treatment of German prisoners during World War II, chose transformation. It was not always perfect in that choice, and not every prisoner was transformed. But enough were changed, and changed deeply enough, that the choice made a difference. It made a difference in the lives of individual prisoners who returned to build new lives in a new Germany. It made a difference in the reconstruction of Germany itself. And it made a difference in how the world thinks about the treatment of prisoners of war and the possibilities of reconciliation after conflict. Today, when we consider how to deal with captured enemies, how to approach reconstruction after war, and how to break cycles of violence and hatred, we can look back to the American treatment of German POWs in World War II as both inspiration and instruction. The lesson is clear. Strength is not only the ability to defeat enemies, but the wisdom to transform them into friends. As we stand now, more than 7 decades removed from those events, the generation that experienced them is nearly gone. The German prisoners who learned democracy in American camps, the American guards who taught them, the families who welcomed them into their communities, all have mostly passed from the scene. But their legacy remains. It remains in the democratic institutions of modern Germany, built in part by men who learned their first lessons about democracy as prisoners of war. It remains in the strong alliance between Germany and the United States, a relationship that would have seemed impossible in the dark days of 1943. And it remains in the enduring principle that even in the midst of total war, there is room for humanity, for dignity, and for the recognition that yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's friend. The story of the German POWs in America is ultimately a story about hope, about the possibility of change, and about the power of treating others with dignity even when they do not expect it and perhaps do not deserve it. It is a reminder that the true victories in human history are not only those won on battlefields, but those won in hearts and minds. When that German train pulled into that American hospital in June 1943, no one could have predicted the transformation that would follow. The prisoners expected brutality. They found compassion. They expected punishment. They found rehabilitation. They expected to remain enemies forever. Instead, they began a journey that would turn many of them into advocates for the very nation they had fought against. That journey, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, helped change the course of history. It stands as testimony to a simple but profound truth, that how we treat our enemies in victory defines us more than how we fight them in war.